It's very difficult, and the reason is that the current government has chosen, as frankly would any government, to reduce the deficit substantially by cutting spending. You could debate it could be done slightly more by putting up taxes rather than cutting spending, but in the end the deficit has to come down, and that has meant that overall public spending has been held flat, but because some items have been protected, particularly the NHS and in the end most of welfare, particularly pensions, international development and so on, that everything else, which includes local government, has had to be squeezed very hard. And that's happened for the years 2010 all the way through to this year, but it's going to go on like this at least till the end of the decade. Well, there's no question any organisation can be more efficient. Interesting, I don't think many people privately would disagree with the idea that local government was always pretty efficient. It hadn't had anything like the massive spending increases that other parts of the public sector had had in the decade up to, say, 2009 or 2010. And it's been very efficient at dealing with cuts since then. But I think the wider question is, can it really be that only local government was inefficient? What about the rest of the public sector, much of which has been protected? And whilst I wouldn't want to single out any individual part of the rest of the public sector, we can all think of our experiences using other parts of government and, ask, well, is that really as efficient as it might be? So I'm sure local government could have made efficiencies and has, but the idea the rest of the public sector couldn't make equivalent efficiencies can't be true. It must be true that they could do this too. Well, up till now, local authorities have been amazingly good at protecting services and frankly at keeping very high levels of public satisfaction. I mean, almost it's a problem that they're so good at sustaining levels of public satisfaction, because that takes the pressure off the government from understanding how difficult it is for councils making the reductions. But looking ahead, of course, councils can't spend nothing on services, so the deeper the cuts, the bigger the problem that come for council leaders and their cabinet members and officers. And that's not going to go away in the next few years. So I think we've seen councils manage so far. What none of us knows is whether there's a tipping point somewhere further along the road where it's going to be, for example, impossible to sustain all the things that councils by law must do. And they might, but they might not. We just don't know that till we get there, partly because we're not sure what the public spending figures will be beyond the next general election. Well, interestingly, opinion polls show that the public understands that local government isn't making cuts just because it wants to. They get the fact that it's almost entirely because the government is requiring it of local authorities. So that they get. But of course, when it comes to why isn't my street being swept, or why isn't social services better, or whatever the problem is, they're bound to hold the council to account, because it is literally the council's duty, whether district or county, varies from service to service. So I think the public will begin to look to councillors and say, well, why are refuse collections, I'm not saying they are, but if it happens, why aren't refuse collections as good as they once were? Why is the entitlement to care for the elderly being cut if that's what happens here too? And councillors will have to explain that. They can't just say, well, it's all the government's fault, even if the public deep down knows it is. So I think it will make the relationship between councillors and members of the public more challenging for councillors and for members of the public over the coming years. Well, we have perfectly respectable county unitaries in Shropshire and Cornwall. They work perfectly well. I think if you go for a county unitary, you've got then to have some form of representation at a very local level. You've got to retain that, because people live in their local towns or villages. They've got to have that. But if people want unitary local government, then they're free to ask for it. And personally, if that's what they want, I believe in allowing local people to choose what they want. So if that's what they want, I'd go for it. But if they don't, that's different.
But if they don't, what would that mean for the further pressure on local government finances?
Well, if they don't, it means continuing with more overheads perhaps than would otherwise have been the case, and it would put enormous pressure, if you kept the two sets of councils, for the county and the districts to find ways of working together more efficiently, short of creating a single unitary authority. And that would mean possibly quite detailed joint working for a range of local services.